Your right to quit your job and work somewhere else. Your right to negotiate your salary. Your right to move to a different city whenever you feel like it. These feel like basic, obvious, fundamental human rights. But for most of human history, they didn't exist. For centuries, the majority of people in Europe had none of them. You were born into a class. You stayed in that class. You worked the land you were assigned, for the Lord you were assigned, until you died. And then, in 4 years, a plague killed between a third and a half of every human being in Europe. And everything changed. Not because anyone planned it, not because of a revolution or a war or a great leader with a vision, but because of simple, brutal mathematics. Suddenly, there weren't enough workers, and for the first time in centuries, the people at the bottom of society had the power. This is the story of how the worst catastrophe in human history accidentally created the world you live in today. To understand what the Black Death changed, you need to understand what Europe looked like before it arrived. The word is feudalism, and if you were born into it, it was the only reality you had ever known. At the top was the king. Below him, the nobles and lords who owned the land. Below them, the knights who protected it. And at the very bottom, making up the vast majority of the population, were the serfs, the peasants, the people who actually made everything work. A serf's life was not their own. They were bound to the land they worked, legally, permanently, from birth. They couldn't leave the estate without their lord's permission. They couldn't marry without their lord's permission. A significant portion of everything they grew went directly to the lord as tax. In exchange, they received protection and the right to farm a small plot of land to feed their family. It wasn't slavery, but it wasn't far from it. And this system had been in place, largely unchanged, for centuries. Generation after generation of peasants living and dying on the same land, under the same lords, with no realistic prospect of anything different. Then in 1347, a Genoese trading ship docked in Sicily. Several sailors were dead. The ones still alive were covered in black, oozing boils the size of eggs. The port authorities ordered the ship out of the harbor immediately. It was already too late. What followed was the most devastating biological event in human history. The Black Death. Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats, swept across Europe with terrifying speed. It moved along trade routes, through cities, and across borders. There was nowhere to run because it was everywhere at once. The symptoms were horrifying. Swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, in the neck, armpits, and groin. Blackening skin from internal bleeding. Fever, vomiting, excruciating pain. Most people who showed symptoms were dead within a few days. And then there was the pneumonic form, spread through air, where you could catch it simply by breathing near someone infected. That version killed within hours. Medieval medicine had no answer. Doctors wore strange, beaked masks filled with herbs and spices to filter the air. They bled patients, prescribed astrology and prayer. None of it worked. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed an estimated 25 million people. In 4 years. In some cities, Florence, Venice, London, more than half of the population died. Entire villages simply ceased to exist. Bodies piled faster than they could be buried. Priests refused to administer last rites out of fear. Families abandoned dying relatives. Parents abandoned dying children. One chronicler wrote at the time, "This is the end of the world." he wasn't wrong about the scale. He was wrong about what came next. This is where the story becomes extraordinary. When the plague passed, the survivors looked around at a Europe that had lost between a third and half of its people. And something had quietly, fundamentally shifted. Labor was scarce, desperately, catastrophically scarce. Think about what that means for a feudal lord who suddenly has half the workers he had before. His fields still need harvested. His estate still needs to be managed, but half the serfs are dead. The ones who survived know it, and for the first time in their lives, they have leverage. A serf could walk up to his lord and say, "I want higher wages. I want better conditions. I want my children to be free." And the lord, who just 2 years ago would have had that man thrown in a dungeon, had to listen. Because if he didn't, the serf would simply walk to the next estate, where a desperate lord would take him. Wages across Europe began to rise rapidly. In England, agricultural wages doubled within a generation of the plague. Peasants, who never owned anything, began accumulating small amounts of wealth. They bought better tools, better food, better clothing. They started moving to towns and cities where wages were even higher. The feudal pyramid, unchanged for centuries, was cracking from the bottom up. Lords panicked. Across Europe, the nobility tried desperately to put the genie back in the bottle. In England, the Statute of Laborers in 1351 tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers from moving. In France, similar laws were passed. In every country, the message was the same: get back in your place. It didn't work. Because you cannot legislate mathematics. There simply were not enough workers, and no law could change that. The consequences rippled outward in ways nobody predicted. With peasants gaining economic power for the first time, the rigid social hierarchy of feudalism began to erode. People started questioning things they had never before questioned. Why should a man be bound to land he didn't choose? Why should one family rule, simply because of birth? Why does God allow the good and the wicked to die equally in a plague? The last question was explosive. The church, which had told people for centuries that suffering was God's plan and their place in society was divinely ordained, had no answer for the Black Death. Priests died as fast as peasants. Prayer didn't work. The institution that had provided the moral justification for the entire feudal order had been exposed as powerless. Church authority began to erode. New religious movements emerged. People started reading the Bible for themselves rather than relying on priests to interpret it for them. Sound familiar? 160 years after the Black Death, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door and triggered the Protestant Reformation. The seeds were planted in the plague years. The Renaissance followed similar logic. With the old order destabilized, new ideas had room to grow. The wealth redistributed by the plague created new patrons for art and learning. The questioning of authority that began with, "Why did God let this happen?" eventually became, "What if everything we've been told is wrong?" Humanism, scientific inquiry, individual rights. All of it has roots that trace back to the years when a third of Europe died, and the survivors asked, why were we living like this? The feudal system didn't end overnight. It took generations. There were revolts, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie, brutal uprisings by people who had tasted freedom and weren't going back. They were crushed. The leaders were executed. But the momentum couldn't be stopped. By the 15th century, serfdom had largely disappeared in Western Europe. Wage labor had replaced feudal obligation. A middle class, merchants, skilled craftsmen, educated professionals, was emerging for the first time. The foundations of the world we recognize were being laid. All of it accelerated, catalyzed, made possible by a plague that killed 25 million people. The Black Death didn't plan any of this. It had no agenda. It was a bacterium on a flea, on a rat on a ship. It didn't care about feudalism or workers' rights or the Renaissance. It just killed people indiscriminately. But indiscriminate death turned out to be the most radical equalizer in history. When enough people die, the right people and the wrong people, the powerful and the powerless, the lord and the serf, the ones who survive get to renegotiate everything. Your right to quit your job, your right to negotiate your salary, your right to live where you choose. None of these things were given to people. They weren't granted by generous kings or enlightened philosophers. They were taken, slowly, painfully, over generations, by people who survived the worst thing that had ever happened to them, and decided that the world on the other side had to be different. The Black Death killed a third of Europe, and in doing so, accidentally freed the rest. The worst things that happen to the world sometimes make the world better. Not because suffering is good, but because sometimes it takes catastrophe to break the systems that were never going to change on their own.